The Umayyads were Sunni Muslims. So 90 to 92% of the population of the Islamic world then, as today, are Sunni Muslims. And the first dynasty, and this is the, don't trouble yourself with the names, but look at the number, look at where the numbers are. This is a dynasty in the truest sense of the word, where succession is from father to son, or from man to brother, or from man to uncle or nephew. And so it constitutes a dynasty in the truest sense of the word. And ideologically, they developed this worldview, that Arabness, now pay very close attention here, Arabness rather than Muslimness becomes the main criterion for elite status. Religion's still important, but to be among the ruling class, you have to be Arab, and preferably Arabs related to the Umayyad family. Okay? Now, by this time, the Arab world has included this lime-colored area, and there are far more non-Arabs in this area than there are Arabs. But given the worldview of the rulers, they have set themselves up for a major revolution. Okay? And that's exactly what happened, the Abbasid revolution. So what is a revolution? I mean, we all have some notion of what a revolution is, but I would suggest thinking of a revolution as the supplanting of one order of things with another. So the Abbasids won the revolution. It took place from 750 to 754, and they changed a whole bunch of things in Islam. Important to know what those changes are. First of all, their revolution was Catholic in the sense of universal. Right? So they saw Islam as ideally spreading everywhere. They saw it as fundamentalist. That means going back to running things during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So Salafist Muslims today have that same fundamentalist worldview. I mean, there's a problem with it, particularly in today's world, because, for example, there were no computers back in Muhammad's day, and Salafists are incredibly experts at electronic technology and the use of computers and social media and so on. So they're very selective in how far they want to go back. Okay, third point, vengeance for the martyrs of Islam. So now we've had two civil wars, and there were plenty of martyrs. Two main ones were the two sons of Ali. And so part of their ideology, and there's nothing like vengeance for the martyrs of somebody to create a strong energy. And then finally, rule, and the wording of it is very important here. Rule by an appropriate member of the family of the Prophet. Because they want to be Catholic, they're trying to incorporate something here for everybody. So Shiites believed that was them. Okay, rule by an appropriate member of the family of the Prophet. So here's Muhammad here, and he had all of these daughters. His daughter Fatima married Ali, and then the descendants of Ali were the Shiite caliphs. Okay, but the leader of the revolution was a descendant of Al-Abbas, who was a distant brother of Muhammad, who had immigrated to the Bosphorus, on the far eastern frontier of Islam, and he developed a following there and launched his revolution from quite far away. And so here he is, and then his descendants, it's down here that this man here becomes the first caliph. The civil war lasted 4 years. The first one to rule, really as established caliph, was al-Mansur. Okay, so they built a new capital city. They moved the capital to Baghdad. They built a brand new city at Baghdad, and it was a circular city. Consciously circular, because that's abnormal for a city, but they wanted a new model. This was kind of like a symbol that things are going to be different from now on. They established a professional bureaucracy, and these are the different departments. So the first one here is a Department of State that entered into diplomatic relations with other places. This is the Department of Revenue. like the Internal Revenue Service. This is the Department of Defense. And this is the Post Office Department. That was so interesting. I did a lot of research on how postal facilities worked in early Islam, and it was so complicated and so intricate and so innovative. It was really fascinating. So they had a whole department called the Post Office Department. Most importantly for us is the role of the ulema. Does anyone know what that word means? Okay, Sheikh Osama talked about the ulema last night, but he didn't use the word. So ulema are religious scholars. So anyone who has achieved a certain level of religious education would be considered an alim. Ulema is the plural of that. And so what is their role? Their role is to formulate Sharia. Okay, so what did you get out of that little discussion that we had last night of Sharia?
Basically that it's equivalent to canon law, or it's an Arabic name.
It's an Arabic.
People use the Arabic name, but it's not applied to anyone except a Muslim.
Yeah, so the literal translation for Sharia is the way, or you could even translate it as the law, the way or the law. So when we, not you, we use the English construct Sharia law, we're actually being quite redundant. It's like law. So, but there are other words in Arabic that mean laws, and fiqh is one. Fiqh is laws. So if you walked into the office of an Islamic lawyer and saw all of his law books lined up on the shelves, they would not contain Sharia. They would contain books of fiqh, laws, and legal cases and legal opinions, just like you would find in the law office of people around the square here who have law offices. Another word is kanun, actually, which comes from, it's the same word as canon. It's an Arabized form of, so that means laws too. All right. The most concise and most accurate, in my judgment, definition or description of Sharia is this. And you can all find it because this is from the Wikipedia article on Sharia, which is actually, I'm sure you all know this. I mean, there's some great things on Wikipedia and there's some junk on Wikipedia. The article on Sharia is so good. And it's about 20 pages long. It's not a short article. So I picked out what I thought were the important parts of it. So let's read it together. Sharia, in its strictest definition, is a divine law as expressed in the Quran and Muhammad's example, often called Sunnah, and we get that from the Hadith. Okay? As such, it is related to but different from fiqh, which is emphasized as the human interpretation of the law. So lawyers are into that business of going from Sharia and making fiqh. Okay, so where am I here? I lost my place. Yeah, many scholars have pointed out that the Sharia is not formally a code, nor a well-defined set of rules. I have this friend who, after I explained all of this to him, he said, oh yeah, that's all really interesting, but do you have a copy of the book, the little book where they have all the rules? And I said, no, that's not the point. It's exactly the opposite. The Sharia is characterized as a discussion on the duties of Muslims based on both the opinion of the Muslim community and extensive literature. Hunt Janine and Andre Kallmeyer thus conclude that the Sharia is, quote, long, diverse, and complicated. Now, the next statement is really important. The wide variety of forms of government, systems of law, attitudes toward modernity, and interpretations of Sharia are a result of the ensuing drives for independence and modernity in the Muslim world, you could add, today. So Sharia in Nigeria is not going to be like Sharia practiced here in Murfreesboro. So let me ask you this question. Can you think of any places in the United States where Sharia is, I'm not going to say Sharia law, Sharia is practiced? And the answer is everywhere. I mean, here in Murfreesboro, Sharia is practiced. Let me ask, this is a different question now. Can you think of anywhere in the United States where Sharia is enforced? I would say Nowhere. There is no mechanism to enforce Sharia here in the United States. Some Islamophobes say that Dearborn, Michigan. You all have heard about Dearborn, Michigan, right? Yes? No? Okay, so Dearborn, Michigan has probably the highest concentration of Muslims anywhere in the United States. 33% of the population of Dearborn is Muslim. So Islamophobes say there. Now there's an example where Sharia law is really taking over. How ridiculous. I mean, have any of you ever been to Dearborn? All right, go to Dearborn, and you will find delicatessens selling ham sandwiches everywhere. I mean, that's one of the real favorite things in Dearborn. You will find liquor stores on every corner, both of which are prohibited by Sharia, by the way. And you would find 55 Christian churches juxtaposed to the 6 mosques in Dearborn, Michigan. And think of it. Even though that's such a high concentration of people, 33%, how can 33% of the population of a city dictate the law for the other 67%? It's just impossible. The mayor of Dearborn has this own little battle on his hands of refuting the claims that Dearborn, Michigan is run by Sharia law. I mean, he has this own little personal crusade responding to these accusations. Every time an article comes out somewhere that says this, you know, he sees it as his job to respond to that. Just kind of what I said. Now, Sharia and the U.S. Constitution. This is interesting. So what is the relationship between Sharia and, I mean, Sheikh Osama was wonderful about this. And it actually taught me something I didn't know. I didn't know that it went, I mean, I knew it was the case that if a person chose to immigrate here, but I didn't know that it started when they accepted the visa. That was really interesting. But I mean, that's clear in the Quran. I mean, that requirement, that element of Sharia is clear in the Quran. Here's the verse, chapter 4, verse 59. O you who believe, obey God. So you who believe, obey God and obey the messenger and those in authority from among you. That means your rulers, wherever you live. Then, now this is important too and interesting, then if you quarrel about anything, refer it to God and the messenger, if you believe in God in the last day. Now that last phrase represents or raises the question, what happens if there's a conflict between Sharia and what the U.S. Constitution says? So what do you think the options of a Muslim would be if he ran into that kind of conflict? If something that his conscience said, the Sharia requires this of me, but the Constitution requires that, and they're in conflict, what are his options?
Wait for God to deal with it at the end?
Huh?
Wait for God to deal with it at the end?
You could, but what would you do in the meantime?
Allow the law that you have accepted, the authority in which you have accepted to be the rule.
Yeah, okay, so you can submit to the local authority, that's one choice. What would be another option? He would leave. Okay, so you could leave and go and live somewhere else. That would be a second choice.
Couldn't you claim religious freedom in the Constitution?
What? Well, okay, well, to a point. Well, okay, so you could appeal your case through the legal system, right? Or you could lobby legislators to change the law, or you could practice civil disobedience. But of course, you know that civil disobedience requires accepting the consequences of that. So, but those are exactly the same options that a Christian would face if something that they believed in from their Christian perspective conflicted with, well, like abortion, for example, or whatever.
This is just an interjection. With all the spending on the young man that did the shooting in Chattanooga yesterday, it appears that he may have been dealing with this issue. Because he had returned home to his mother country at one point and then returned to the States, and according to the spinning, it looked like he was going through trying to Americanize versus keeping his culture.
It could well be. It could well be. I mean, there's a lot, I think, yet to be found out about what was going on there. But there again, I thought Sheikh Osama's response to that was right on. All right, an elephant for Charlemagne.
Question on Sharia. one more, just to clarify in my head.
Okay.
It sounds like Sharia is subject to interpretation
It is, absolutely.
through either each sector, each region, or even each individual imam.
Yes. Well, depending on where you are. Here in the United States, that's certainly true.
Oh, okay.
In Saudi Arabia, that's not true.
Okay.
Okay, so
Caliphate.
in Iran, that's not true. I mean, there are a lot of Muslim countries that are much more hierarchical and authoritative than, and there again, Sheikh Osama, I think, was so enlightening by saying that one of the things he loves about living in the United States is how free he is to be a Muslim. I mean, and that's one of the beauties that our system offers, is that kind of religious freedom. So I'm sure he feels freer to practice Islam today than if he lived in Saudi Arabia. All right, so now I'm changing gears here a little bit. I used to use Aramco magazine a lot for their really interesting little articles, and they had these great illustrations. And so this is an article from a long time ago, March, April 1977. And so the Abbasid Caliph at that time was a man named Harun al-Rashid, probably the most famous caliph of classical Islam. So if you only know of one caliph, it's probably this one. If you've not heard of him, you probably haven't heard of any. So don't worry too much about his name. I just want you to know that he was the contemporary of Charlemagne and entered into diplomatic relations with Charlemagne. They exchanged ambassadors. And one of the sources says that among the gifts that Harun al-Rashid sent to Charlemagne was this elephant, an Asian elephant. Why is that important? The point I want to make here is that the Islamic world at that time, under the Abbasids, it was an empire, and it was an empire that can be best understood to be just like the empire of Charlemagne. The main difference being that Charlemagne was in Europe and Harun al-Rashid was in Asia and Africa. Charlemagne was Christian, Harun al-Rashid was Muslim. Other than that, they were identical. They were imperial rulers. Charlemagne enforced Christianity, incidentally, killed approximately 100,000 Saxons for not accepting Christianity. You know, Harun al-Rashid's approach was similar. But a lot of other things are happening during the Abbasid Caliphate. One was the advancement of science. So these are some of the fields where Islamic scientists excelled during the classical period: medicine, astronomy, mathematics, botany.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I was thinking about that last night that we really didn't go into. But when you were asking sort of the key phrases this morning, what we think about, ancient knowledge was the thing that immediately popped into my mind, because that was really the center of science in its time.
And there's no question that science was much further advanced in the Islamic world than in the Christian world at that time.
And then translated Plato and Aristotle. That's why
Which we probably wouldn't have otherwise. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, chemistry at the bottom. There's one, okay, I put this one in a category of its own because it's the one that I happen to be really interested in. No other reason. Geography. So in the middle of the 10th century, almost exactly in the middle, a man by the name of Ibn Hawqal produced a world map. And there it is. That's a map of the world as Muslim geographers knew it in the middle of the 10th century. Now, what do you recognize in that map? Not much. Probably nothing, and I'll tell you why. The problem is that we in the West have turned their map upside down. Okay, so let's turn it right side up. I mean, it's upside down to them. All the writing is now upside down. But now can you recognize anything? This is Europe. This is Europe, Italy, Greece, the Mediterranean, the Bosphorus, the Nile. So this is Africa. This is the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, Tigris, Euphrates. So now it's beginning to make sense, right? Now, 100 years later, we have a better one, Idrisi's world map, but again, we have the same problem. This is right side up, but we turned it upside down. Now, you turn it upside down and it makes a little bit of sense, right? Okay? When I was in graduate school, one of the historians another one of my idols, Belgian historian by the name of Ferdinand Braudel, you probably heard of him, Louis liked Ferdinand Braudel. He had a nickname, Mr. Mediterranean. This was his area of study. And probably his saying that struck me most powerfully was this one: turn the map of the Mediterranean upside down, and Africa looks much more important. Now, what that taught me is that it's all a matter of perspective. I mean, we look at the world in such a Eurocentric way, and that shapes the way we look at everything, right? Perspective, perspective, perspective. Time for another Nasr-ad-Din story. So, this silly old man, Nasr-ad-Din Hoja, showed up at this village one day, and the residents of the village, I mean, he had quite a reputation, so they said, we're going to have fun with this. So they were hosting this famous scientist, and they said, we're going to invite Nasr-ad-Din to have a conversation with this scholar. And so they introduced the two men. And the scholar said, just to make this a little more interesting, we're going to hold our conversation in silence with sign language. Okay? So the scholar took his walking stick and he drew a circle in the sand, and he handed the stick to Nasr-ad-Din, who drew a line across the middle of the circle. He handed the stick back to the scholar, who drew a second line perpendicular to the first one. The scholar held up 3 fingers, and Nasr-ad-Din held up 4 fingers. And then the scholar did this with his hand, and Nasr-ad-Din did that with his hand. End of conversation. So then the people said to the scholar, well, tell me what happened. And the scholar said, well, first of all, you have introduced me to the smartest man I've ever met. When I told him that the world was round, he said, yes, that's right, and it's divided in the middle by the equator. And then when I said that the world was divided into 4, Nasr-ad-Din said, yes, that's right, 3 parts water, 1 part land. And then when I asked him, why does it rain? Nasr-ad-Din said, well, because when the sun comes out, water evaporates from the lake and it goes up into the sky and it falls. And Nasr-ad-Din is looking at him and he said, it's not the conversation I had. He said, let's sit down and have a pan of baklava. And I said, fine, we'll cut it in half and you have half and I'll have half. And I said, well, what if we cut it in 4 pieces? He said, better. I'll take 3 pieces, you can have 1. And he said, well, we have to heat it up on the, no, he said, yeah, we have to sprinkle some sugar on it. And I said, yes, but we'll heat it up on the fire. Okay, so perspective, perspective, perspective. All right, 5 pillars of Islam. I'm going to go through this real quickly, I hope. But I'm going to add, I had the privilege one day, several years ago, to hear a lecture on the 5 pillars of Islam by Suleiman Niang, who is one of the most eminent Muslim theologians in Washington. And it was brilliant. And he gave such little insights. So here's the first, and I would say the most important pillar of Islam is the profession of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. These are 2 separate statements. Each of them is pregnant with importance. So there is no God but God. In Islam, the unity of God is absolute. There is no compromise to the unity of God. And so when you asked, about the Holy Spirit, or and his answer was, God is everywhere. Okay? And that's an important point. But God is one and God is invisible. And most importantly, I think, for the dialogue portion of this, God is indivisible. Right? So what implications does that have for Christians? Right? So there's an issue there. But that's the first part of the profession. The second part, and Muhammad is his prophet. So he comes at the end of a long string of prophets, but he is the seal of the prophets, meaning that there will be no more new revelations. There can be interpretations of revelation, but no new ones. And in fact, the revelations in the Quran have so many things that are repetitious of what we find in the New Testament and in the Old Testament that already there is not much new stuff. Suleiman Niang, he was from Nigeria, and he loved, for whatever reason, to use electronic metaphors in his speeches. I mean, he was using electronic metaphors all the time. And so he tried to describe the role of Muhammad this way. He said it was as if Muhammad had a red telephone on his desk, you know, like the president had to talk to the head of the Kremlin. And from time to time, God would call Muhammad on the telephone, and he would give him some information. But then when Muhammad died, the telephone line on that red phone was cut. And now if anyone picks up the phone, they get a recorded message. And the message says something like, "We're sorry, but the number that you have dialed has been disconnected. Please consult your latest directory." And the latest directory, of course, is the Quran. Second pillar is prayer. So you saw the positions yesterday. So those two pictures. This is an interesting chart. So it shows when prayers take place. So the first prayer in the morning is Fajr, and that takes place just before sunrise, just before sunrise. The Quran is much more specific. It says when you can distinguish between a white thread and a black thread, that's the time for the first prayer. And that's about 30 minutes before sunup. So try it some morning. Get up 45 minutes before the sun is scheduled to get up and get 2 pieces of thread. Get the thread out the night before. And have them next to your bed and then look at them. And then all of a sudden you'll see that one is white, one is black. And it's sudden. I mean, it's immediate. I mean, at one instant you can't tell the difference, and then an instant later you can tell that one is white and one is white. And that's about 30 minutes before sunup. Time for your first prayer. Most people don't do that. They wait for the muezzin who does that. And well, again, today you don't need the 2 threads, but that's how it's done. Okay. Second prayer is very close to noontime. It's described in the Quran as the point of the day when the sun is at its highest point. So if you put a stick in the ground and there's no shadow, that's time for the second prayer. Third prayer is mid-afternoon or late afternoon. Fourth prayer is just after sundown, so when the distinction between your 2 threads disappears. And then the final prayer is later at night. And there's a lot of flexibility about this, about that last one, especially. Oh, there's flexibility about anyone, and that was another great response Sheikh Osama pointed out, is that if you're busy, if you're working and you don't have time, or you're in a traffic jam or whatever, you can either skip the prayer, or you can do 2 prayers at the next point, or do it whenever you have time, or not at all.
I like how he said to you, Vicky, that it shouldn't be an excuse to be late for class.
Yeah. All right, now here's an insight that I gained, I think on my own, about the importance of how all of this worked. And it was back in 2001, just after Desert Storm started. And of course, I was glued to the television watching this because it was, we were watching war live on live television. And I remember watching the news one night, the 10 o'clock news here in Nashville. And the news journalist stationed in Amman, Jordan, did his nightly broadcast from the same spot every day. And he was standing on a street corner in Amman, and there was a mosque behind him. And one night, the night that I'm referring to now, he said, if you listen carefully, you can hear the call to prayer in the background. So sure enough, listen to the call to, wasn't that beautiful last night when Sheikh Osama did that? So that's what I heard on TV, and I looked at my watch. It was about 10 minutes after 10, so we were 10 minutes into the broadcast. And I'm thinking, oh, that's odd. I'm thinking, well, stupid me. I mean, it's not 10 after 10 in Amman, Jordan. This is tomorrow morning. So they're doing the Fajr prayer in Amman, Jordan. Whereas Muslims here in Nashville, were finishing their Isha prayer. And depending on where they were Muslims all over the world, 1.8 billion of them, more or less, praying the same prayers. Now, for anyone who believes in the power of group prayer, that's pretty powerful. Okay, Ramadan, I don't think I'm going to say any more about Ramadan. You probably heard zakat, that's charity. It's comparable to tithing in Christianity. It's very complicated. How much are they supposed to give? The formula is immensely complicated. Today there are actually calculators programmed to figure out how much a person is supposed to give, but it averages out more or less to pretty close to 2.5%, but not 2.5% of one's income. Rather, it's 2.5% of one's assets. Okay, so there's a big difference there. Now, I had a student, a Saudi student. I was amazed that he chose this topic, and I was more amazed that he actually did it. Wrote his term paper on all of the ways to get around the the tax code in Saudi Arabia.
What does it mean to say Eid Muharram? I tell my friends, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but at the end of the Ramadan, you tell your friends Eid Muharram, I believe, and I. So as a
Maghrib is the prayer that marks the end of the fast at the end. So they're not essentially saying it's now time to break the fast for the day.
So when they're telling each other, because my friends are all saying thank you for that.
And I'm sure that's the case here in Murfreesboro, as in almost any other Muslim community. It's a time for sort of penance. The fast is difficult. I mean, it's a very difficult thing. I mean, much more difficult than fasting in Christianity. So it's a total fast from eating and drinking, smoking, any kind of consumption, from the time you can see the difference between the two threads until the time that you cannot. In the summertime, that's a very long time. Like from 6 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock at night. It's 14 hours. And it's really hot in the summertime. That's really hard. Try it sometime. And it gets a little easier once your stomach adopts. I mean, when I'm in the Islamic world, I do it. Mainly because I just feel part of the community when I do that. And I spend a lot of time I'm usually alone as the only non-Muslim around. And it's lonely if you're not part of the community. So I do it. I mean, I fast. And so I know how difficult it is. But come time to break the fast, it's a time for families to come together and really celebrate. And they have a lot to celebrate. So among the reasons for doing this, first of all, it's a sign of obedience. They're asked to do this by God and by the prophet. It's a means of developing a sense of self-discipline. So besides doing the fast, a lot of people, make these sort of like New Year's resolutions that I'm going to go on a diet after Ramadan and I'm going to start working out. So the gyms are full all over the Muslim world. During Ramadan, a lot of them can do it, but then they quit after that. It's a really spiritual time. Well, here's an anecdote. I'm racing with time now, but so several years ago, I had a Moroccan student who decided to come to MTSU to do his master's degree with me. I don't know if you remember him, Shukri Hadoushi. And he was a very religious person. And so Ramadan was during the school year. And I would see him virtually every day. And I remember one day he came to my office, and it was the last week of Ramadan, so there were 2 or 3 days left to go. And he looked absolutely terrible. I mean, his lips were swollen and split because he was dehydrated. His eyes were puffy, and he had no color in his face, and he was dragging along. And I said to him, Shukri, you only got 2 or 3 more days left. Just hang on. It's going to be okay. And he said, what? Do you think I'm in a hurry for this to be over with? He said, this is such a spiritual period of time for me. And I'm looking forward to the end of the day when I can be with my brothers and sisters to celebrate the breaking of the fast. And I'll tell you what that taught me. It taught me that his approach to religion was a bit different than mine. There are a lot of reasons why you don't have to fast. I mean, anyone who's sick is not expected to fast. Pregnant women are forbidden to fast. People who are traveling are not required to fast. So I used to say jokingly, well, I would just schedule my vacation during Ramadan and I'd be traveling somewhere and I'd be okay. So my approach to religion is sort of like income tax. You know, you get the form and you look for all of the deductions and you try to, get out of as much as possible. But Shukri's approach was not like that. And the approach of many of my Muslim friends is not like that. It's something that they crave. And I find that pretty inspiring. Okay, and the fifth pillar is the pilgrimage to Mecca. And this is once during one's lifetime. But once during one's lifetime, one is required to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is a pretty expensive thing for a lot of people. I mean, if you live in Saudi Arabia, it's not so expensive, but if you live here, it'd be really expensive. But you don't have to do it if you can't afford it. And you don't have to do it if you're sick or certainly crippled. You would never have to do it. So there are, again, a lot of exemptions to the requirement. Now, why would anybody want to do it? Well, again, there are a lot of reasons. It's a symbol of obedience. They're asked to do it. But the most interesting reason that I heard one day was from a woman, a friend of mine who lives in Egypt. Actually a peasant farmer who lives in Upper Egypt, not too far from Luxor. And I was visiting him and his family one day. And he was telling me that so he lived with his wife and 3 children and his mother. And he was telling me that his family, he and his brothers, no, he had one brother. That's right, he didn't have a brother. He had a brother, but didn't have one then. His brother died. So he had 3 sisters. So he and his 3 sisters were saving up money to send their mother on the pilgrimage before she died. And she was elderly. And then his mother chimed in and said, how much she was really looking forward to this. And so I asked her why she was looking forward to it. And she said, well, I'll tell you. She said, it's a very specific reason. She said, when I was a young woman, I committed a very serious sin. And I'm thinking, okay, I don't need to hear any more of this. But she went on and she said, when my husband and I were married, I had my first child about a year later, and I gave birth to a little girl. And my husband was a little disappointed, but he was very happy to have a daughter. Then I gave birth to a second child, and that was a little girl. And then I gave birth to a third child, and that was a little girl. And I felt terrible, she said. And so I prayed to the ancient Egyptian goddess Hathor, the goddess of fertility. My next child was a boy, stillborn, punishment. And that was the sin that she was living with. And she said, making the pilgrimage to Mecca will relieve me of that burden that I've been carrying all this time. So that's another reason that people, and that's, I think, in her case, a very personal reason. And I don't know that that's true for all Muslims who do it. And so that, again, a lesson is that different Muslims have different reasons for doing whatever they do. Oops. Did you read that? Islamic art. So we're going to do a little thing on Islamic art, again, because I think it has an important lesson to teach us. And my thinking here comes from a book that I read a long time ago. It was a book that was written a really long time ago by a German scholar, Wilhelm Loeringer. Title of his book is Form in Gothic. I think it was 1917 when he wrote this book. He wrote it in German. And he talks about this concept called will, that he calls will to form. And he defines that. Will to form is that set of artistic tools that any culture develops that best express their worldview. So if one culture's art looks different from another culture's art, it's because they have something very different that they're trying to say. Does that make sense? Okay. He then starts making distinctions. His first distinction is between two big categories of art. One category he would call natural art. His example is ancient Greek art. So a statue of a man looks like a man. Still art today would be another example of that, like a painting of an apple looks like an apple, right? Okay. The other category, or the other, so the other category is what he calls stylized art, which is not natural. His example is ancient Egyptian art where things look strange, not natural. So far, so good? Okay. And I don't have slides to illustrate this next dichotomy, but he describes some art as being beautiful, and that's an aesthetic quality. And then he describes some art as being, and I don't have an English word for this. The German word that he used was Kunstwissenschaft, which translates something like the science of art. And he said that's not an aesthetic quality, it's an intellectual quality. It's what it means. Okay? So one category is what it looks like, and the other category is what it means. All right. And then he goes through examples chronologically to talk about what different cultures did with this, starting with cave painting. Okay, so when we look at these cave paintings, the question that a lot of people ask is why would anybody go inside of caves where it's really dark and paint these pictures where nobody can see them? Any thoughts on that? Well, what? Well, sometimes, but usually, we call them cavemen, but they usually, I don't think they lived in caves that much.
Preservation of history? Yeah.
Preservation of history, that's really good. That's very good.
They're magical.
They sort of, no, that's the most common interpretation. They have something to do with the hunt, right? So by drawing these animals, they'll be able to better go out and hunt them. Now, why would that be the case? They don't have a written language, right? And what they're really doing here is conceptualizing what a bull is, or conceptualizing what a reindeer is, because that's information you need to know if you're going to go out and capture these or hunt them. They're much bigger and stronger and faster than human beings are, so you got to outsmart them, right? Okay, and so that's their way of articulating the basic concepts, and that's why they look very basic. And they had to do that because prehistoric men and women lived on the edge of survival, right? And so this was very important for them to be able to do this. Then he gets to ancient Greece, and they had a very different worldview. They were not living on the edge of survival. They were so confident in their human ability to deal with nature that they celebrated that human ability. And they celebrated it every 4 years on Mount Olympus, just like we reenact every 4 years, every 2 years now, with the Olympics, right? So their way of doing art, they did things in very human terms. They defined excellence in human terms. So much so that when they decided to imagine what gods looked like, they looked like human beings. Now we get to the Middle Ages. So how would you describe this? Natural or stylized? Stylized, clearly stylized, right? And I used to have fun with this in my Western Civ class. I would ask the students, what are they doing here? Why does this look so strange? And they would say, well, the Romans were really good at doing art. And then along came the barbarians and they destroyed it all. And people had to start learning how to do art all over again. I'd say, okay, thank you very much. This is an 8th century page from the Gospel of St. Mark. This is a 13th century manuscript. In 500 years, they have not learned one single thing. So there's clearly something else going on here. Now we look at this page from a medieval artist who actually wrote in the margin, and I didn't get that in the picture, that the basic element of portraiture is geometry. So if things in medieval manuscripts look angular and sharp, it's because that's exactly how they wanted them to look. It's not that they couldn't do something else, but this is what they wanted to do because it said what they wanted to say better. Now, and that's true in architecture as well as drawing. So to me, this is one of the ultimate Gothic cathedrals in Europe, the Cathedral of Ulm, where in Gothic architecture, the lines go predominantly, in this case, exclusively in one direction, right? Vertical. Is there a message here? Does it work? Do you think it works? Have any of you been to Chartres Cathedral? I'm sure some of you have. So, okay, so they, and I don't know if he's still there, but there used to be this Englishman there, Malcolm Miller, and he prided himself, he would introduce himself as the Englishman of Chartres. And he would give these lectures and then collect tips. And he was brilliant. I actually invited him to MTSU twice. So he and I became good friends. And he would walk through the cathedral, and he wouldn't do the whole cathedral. He would stop in front of 2 or 3 stained glass windows or 2 or 3 statue groups, and he would say, he would preface his description of whatever you were looking at, and he would say, "Let's read." And so he would look at the window and read it as it was a book. And of course, you've all heard the expression, or many of you have heard the expression, is that the medieval cathedral was the Bible of the poor. Right, so there were actually Bible stories burned into stained glass or carved in stone. Okay, that's how European religious art works. It's narrative. Islamic architecture is a totally different ballgame. Totally different. You will not find images of living beings. A couple of exceptions, but almost none. So it's this, and so the elements are calligraphy, geometry. All right, I had to get this slide in. This is the site that I'm working on now, my archaeological site. And I put it there because I wanted you to see it. But also, I'm going to use the excuse of pointing out this basin in the middle of the courtyard, which is an octagon. You know, an octagon is not very easy to make. There are 18, back. Yeah. I'm going too fast here. 18 separate mathematical steps required to make an octagon. And so my point is that the geometry that one observes in a mosque is a set of very, very complicated mathematical or geometric formulas. Now, once the formula is established, what can you do with it? How big can you make the picture? Immeasurable. So what better metaphor, or what better way to express the infinity of God, which is invisible, who is invisible, than geometry? And so we often hear that Muslims don't have pictures of people or statues of people in the mosque because they're forbidden. It's actually not true. It doesn't say that anywhere in the Quran. They don't do it because doing this says what they want to say better. I mean, there's a positive reason for doing what they do rather than a negative reason. And one day, I think it was the same class where I had this group of Saudi students moving around campus like a cloud. And one of them was a really, he was a freshman, young kid. And we were talking about the essence of God. It's a pretty difficult topic. And I came up to his desk, and I stood right in front of his desk like that and stared him right in the face, and I said, "Tell me what God looks like." And I knew what his answer was going to be, but actually his answer was nothing. He didn't understand the question, and the question didn't even have any meaning. I mean, he couldn't imagine God looking like anything. So he kind of stood there like, panic. I never did that again. I was pretty embarrassed after doing it, but it certainly made the point to the rest of the class.